So now we know that you have many ways of making yourself understood through pictures, gestures, other strategies like acting it out. We know that speaking loudly has minimal effect, but I put that in there just to see who could I trip up, and not many of you did. So that's good to know that many of you are not falling back on that old myth that if you speak more loudly, people will understand you. Yet we also know that there are other ways, even besides the strategies that we've just talked about. We have other ways like looking at the language, the way we use the language with our students. So for that reason, I want you to see, for example, that using pronouns is important, or fewer pronouns. And when you do, um, make sure that the pronouns have a direct or explicit reference. So, for example, in this slide, we have the text that reads, "The Earth's water is always changing. It changes over and over again in the same pattern as a cycle. It changes forms as a solid, a liquid, or a gas. Ice can form and become water, or gas could be like vapor. Vapor can also change its form to become ice or water. Adding or taking away heat makes it all work as a cycle." So the question is, does the word it refer to the same pronoun in each instance? If you were a beginning English learner, I would imagine that just the use of one type of pronoun can be pretty complicated. Can you imagine if we sprinkled in more pronouns there? Now, another thing that you can do is to limit the use of your contractions for beginning learners, because they can be a source of misunderstanding, especially if you're using the language orally. So instead of saying should have, use should have instead of can't, that sometimes our second language learners cannot hear the distinction between can and can't. So it's safer to say cannot. Can you list other confusing contractions? Quickly write them down and keep that list close to you when you teach so that you can remember to avoid those. Another thing you can do is to to simplify your sentences. When you have very long sentences, it's very easy for beginning learners to get lost in what was being said at the beginning because they're doing so much processing in terms of meaning and sound, and again, trying to transfer meaning. So try to take sentences like this one and see if you can chop them up into smaller sentences. So then you can shorten your sentences to become something like this. Instead of saying heat makes ice melts, in turn making it evaporate in what we call water vapor, instead you can write or say heat makes ice melt. Heat also makes water evaporate. It can then become water vapor. So those shorter segments become easier to remember and therefore help the learner keep the meaning across your utterances. Here are a few other tips. Limit the use of synonyms for the beginning learners. Although synonyms make your speech more interesting to a more advanced listener or reader, they can be a source of confusion for beginners because they won't necessarily see them as synonyms. So if you're to use the word opinion, keep using that instead of uh, using other words like conclusion, view, assertion, position, theory, because although they can be synonyms, they have slightly different meanings, and those can really throw off your listeners. Instead, use high frequency words that, again, are words that are about the 2 or 3,000 most frequently used words in the English language. Words like who, more, said, about, for, the. You can go to these following links that will give you more information about the most commonly used words. And then you can decide which ones are the most useful to you. Use the same words consistently. So again, by limiting synonyms and using high frequency words, you're recycling those same words more consistently. And then when new words come in, just use those few new words over and over again so they can become cemented, if you will, in the learner's repertoire. And then another tip is to avoid idioms. Here is an example. My mother always told us there is no use crying over spilt milk. Have you ever been in a second language situation where people have used an idiom and you have absolutely no idea what they're talking about? The meaning just completely is opaque for you. I've spoken Spanish just about all my life, but I still quite often hear idioms spoken in Spanish that completely throw me off. So this is something that's not just limited to beginning learners. Even intermediate learners have a hard time with idioms. They're very hard to avoid, however. And so when you must use idioms, then go ahead and explain them. So you would say something like, my mother always told us there is no use crying over spilt milk. That means you should not get mad when something bad happens and you cannot change it. That way, you're providing access for your learners to understand your meaning. Okay, so a great second language teacher uses a lot of the tips that we were just talking about. She also, or he also, takes care of the manner in which he speaks, in the volume, the intonation, how clearly you enunciate to make your words clear, the rate at which you speak, and the pauses, making them natural pauses, but nonetheless paying attention to when you do pause. In a moment, you'll hear a short reading. Listen for the manner in which the teacher speaks. This is from VOA News. Observe the speaker's volume, clarity, so I don't think you'll hear him mumbling. Observe the rate at which he speaks and where he chooses to pause. And think about how those items help beginning English learners. So here we go.
The special English program, Words and Their Stories. The white swan, with its long, graceful neck, is among the most beautiful of birds. The swan is mostly silent through its life. It floats quietly on the water, unable to sing sweet songs like most other birds. In ancient times, however, people believed that the swan was given a special gift of song at the end of its life. They believed a swan sings a most beautiful song just before it dies. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates talked of this more than 2,300 years ago. Socrates explained that the swan was singing because it was happy. The bird was happy because it was going to serve the Greek god Apollo. Swans were holy to Apollo, the god of poetry and song. The story of the swan's last song found a place in the works of other writers, including the early English writers Chaucer and Shakespeare. And the expression swan song has long been a part of the English language. At first, swan song meant the last work of a poet, musician, or writer. Now, it means the final effort of any person. Someone's swan song usually is also considered that person's finest work.
I think you would imagine that this feels pretty professional to you. So I'd like you, again, to take a survey. Think about the speaker's volume, his intonation, clarity, rate, and pauses. Vote yes if it's a thumbs up that you think that he did a good job, or no, a thumbs down if you think he did not do a good job. Go ahead and vote now. Now this is the same text. Again, it's from VOA News. Now I want you to read it again and think about why this text is good for beginners. Think about the sentence structure, if it's complex or simple, for the most part. Some parts might be a little more complex, but in general, think about the complexity of the sentence structure, if the pronouns have direct or indirect reference. See if there are if synonyms are used frequently, and if they are used, if they're explained. And then think about idioms. See if there are idioms that are used frequently, and if they are used, if they're explained. Go ahead and read through that now. Okay, now here is another survey. Remember the checklist below and vote. Decide on one of the choices if, for the most part, the sentence structure is complex or simple, and so forth. Think about if this text is appropriate for beginning English learners who are older than 12 years of age. That will help you put that in context. And go ahead and vote now. At some point, do the same for yourself. Audio record, or even better, film yourself and observe how you measure up with these 4 items. If you can give yourself thumbs up on these, you're going to go a long way to helping your students understand your speech. And then the last part of this presentation is about teaching with interaction. And when we do that, one way to do it is by teaching the text backwards. What do we mean by that? This is coined by some researchers at the Center for Applied Linguistics. And I'd like you to remember when you were in school, way back then. For some of us, it's a lot longer. And think about when you might have been in a history class. What did the teacher normally have you do at the beginning of a unit? Chances are he would ask you to read the chapter at home. And then the next day you would answer the questions at the end of the chapter and then have a class discussion. If you were lucky, you might even be able to work on a related project. So the sequence is usually something like the one on the slide. What teaching the text backwards does, and especially good with second language learners, is to flip it on its head and teach the text backwards. And what I mean by that is instead have your students apply something, do something hands-on, then discuss it, then read about the topic, and then report on it. And here is what one lesson might look like. You might ask them to use these materials and make the longest bridge using marshmallows and spaghetti. So that would be the application part, doing something hands-on. Then you'll discuss it. Through discussion, you can ask them what parts of the bridge are longest and why. This will pull out vocabulary, and you can model vocabulary for them. And then through your discussion, you can reach some conclusions like the longer the bridge is, then the more support it needs at its base. Then you can have them read about it, and then they can report on it. And this is what a report would look like, which is much more formal than the oral language that they would use in their discussion. So in summary, what you want to do is teach for transfer by linking to prior knowledge, using graphic organizers, using comprehensibility,